And tonight we want to focus more on how Jackson's life continues to influence modern civil rights advocacy. Joining us now is George Mason University professor and political scientist Michael Fauntroy to discuss the impact that Reverend Jackson had on D.C. and the nation. Professor Fauntroy, thanks for making time for us this evening.
Well, it's always good to see you, Leslie.
You know, you spend a lot of time in front of young people, and you have done this for many years. And I wonder what you tell them now about what they need to understand about Reverend Jackson's legacy, particularly in today's political climate.
Well, it's really interesting how this particular case is sort of juxtaposed theory and practice. I teach a course on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons on the American presidency. And so I spent a few minutes today, in fact, talking to my students, most of whom are 18 to 22 years old and have no real knowledge of Jesse Jackson. And one of the points that I was trying to make today was that he has a unique distinction of somebody who ran for president, lost, but still had a long tail legacy, if you will, creating opportunities for other people to come in his wake. When you think about people like Ron Brown, who cut his teeth on Jesse's 1984 and 1988 campaigns and later got Bill Clinton across the finish line in 1992 as chairman of the Democratic National Committee, or all of the people that were elected in the 80s and into the 90s based on voter registration efforts in support of Jesse Jackson's campaigns. You're talking about somebody who has helped to sort of memorialize a certain kind of progressive Black politics that we haven't seen since and might not see again anytime soon.
Yeah, a lot of the young people that you teach know about President Obama, but they may not have realized the path that was laid for President Obama and how it was paved by Jesse Jackson. You know, he did some incredible work with his Rainbow Coalition, really planting seeds and laying the groundwork for what democracy and the Democratic Party look like today.
So again, this is really interesting in that names and faces continue over time. I showed my students a picture of Jesse Jackson shaking the hand of a younger Bernie Sanders in 1988. Bernie Sanders was one of his biggest supporters in both 1984 and 1988 campaigns. They sort of bonded on the Rainbow Coalition concept that Jackson had created, in which people from various backgrounds came together around a certain set of progressive principles. Well, my students have no sense of that. And so being able to share that and use this as an example of how domestic electoral presidential politics can work is a great tribute to Jesse in some ways, because it shows that he did something beyond just running. He inspired several people from a variety of different perspectives to organize, be active, run for office, and pave the way for people like Barack Obama.
Let's talk a bit more about Jackson's national prominence, obviously those two presidential cycles where he ran, how that helped to elevate D.C.'s political importance on the national stage. D.C., which had been so disenfranchised back then, still is now, but certainly more back then.
So this is really interesting. You look at the arc of Jesse Jackson post 1968. He sort of was trying to figure out where to land his career, so to speak, in terms of advocacy. And the 1984 and 1988 campaigns, particularly the 1984 one, was seen more as sort of an ego-driven kind of thing for him, almost a personality play of sorts. But as the 88 campaign came on, he showed a broader range of ideas, speaking out on several issues beyond just what some folks thought a Black presidential candidate would. And he comes much closer to the nomination in 1988 than he did in 1984. But then the question becomes, well, what happens next? A 1992 campaign wasn't really in the cards. I think everybody understood he sort of hit a ceiling. And that's where D.C. comes into play. He moves to D.C. Near Howard University, right off 4th Street, and begins to get involved in local politics. He runs for shadow senator in part because there was some momentum toward giving DC representation in the Senate, and he, was angling for some of that, if you will. But his advocacy for DC was actually pretty important and very helpful in supporting some of the people who had been in DC for years moving in that space. And so Jesse Jackson, local in DC, national around the country, and internationally, as the Ed O'Keefe piece showed us, he played a significant role. And I should just add quickly, he was also a real agitator for the ending of apartheid in South Africa, something that the piece didn't mention, but certainly is warranted here.
Indeed. Can we stay a little bit with this activism and this intersection here with DC and the fight for statehood and greater representation in Congress? Because he had framed DC disenfranchisement back then as a moral failure of American democracy. And so it was a powerful frame with which to view it. I wonder if you think he succeeded in some way in elevating this issue of DC statehood on the national stage.
Right. Yes, I think he did in that he made it a core principle of his 1988 campaign. Unfortunately, though, history has shown that America's attention span around these kinds of issues is kind of short. So, there was a period where the iron was hot, so to speak, and that was the time to strike. And there were some attempts to do that, but over time, the iron cooled, and so we don't feel the same way about it the way we used to, particularly in terms of certain generations. If you're of a certain generation, you remember this as part of the Democratic left, if you will, ideal or set of principles, but that has sort of worn off over the years.
Let's talk about when historians look back decades from now, how they will remember the impact of Jesse Jackson.
Well, I think it's difficult to look back on the last quarter of the 20th century American presidential electoral politics and not be able to discuss Jesse Jackson at some level. He moved the Democratic Party toward a more open viewpoint around certain kinds of issues, social issues, and such. And so he's worthy of some praise in that regard. And while I know for some people, who are under, say, 40, for example, or perhaps certainly under 30, he had been off the scene for a while as they were coming to their own understanding of American politics, which is why it's so important now in this moment to use it as an education point to show people that political movements ebb and flow, certain principles ebb and flow, but they are powerful voices that keep things on the public radar in ways that are certainly important and necessary. And again, you can't talk about the last quarter of the 20th century American politics, American presidential electoral politics, and not have a conversation about Jesse Jackson. So for me, that is evidence of his importance in the overall American political landscape.
I know that for many of us, Jesse Jackson is an icon, but for you and your family, he is family. And so can you tell me a bit more about the family connection and what you're feeling personally today?
Thank you for mentioning that. My first vote for president was in 1984, and I voted for Jesse Jackson, knowing he had no chance of winning. Right. And I understood that. But this was a protest vote. I wanted to make a statement based on my own sort of political socialization in my own family with my parents and, of course, my Uncle Walter and others who were close to us, many of whom knew Jesse Jackson. And, to be frank, there's some people who had some misgivings about him, but I know for a fact that my uncle thought that he represented the kind of politics that America desperately needed, and so my uncle appreciated him. I just saw him a week or so ago and haven't had a chance to connect with him on this, and I'd be curious to get his thoughts. But yes, there is no question there are connections. Some of our viewers may know that Jesse Jackson Jr. and at least one of Jesse Jackson Sr.'s sons graduated from St. Albans School here in D.C. And so the Jackson family connections to DC are deep, and I can also say there's certainly some connections yeah, with my family. I don't have it handy, but I wish I had the picture I took with him at the commemoration march or the March on Washington some time ago. I'm sitting on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with him and my uncle and Coretta Scott King and Eleanor Holmes Norton, and it was a moment for me that I'll always remember fondly.
You know, you mention names like the Eleanor Holmes Nortons of the world, and I think about all these icons. Obviously, she is still here, but all these
Yes.
icons who were of Jackson's day, who are
Hmm.
leaving us, and how
Right.
important it is to remember that legacy and to talk to them and to learn from them. And so, as we close, I wonder, where do you see Jackson's legacy most alive today?
That's a great question. I think in the Democratic Party, there are people who I would call sort of the godchildren of Jesse Jackson, in that they are pushing for a political party to be more inclusive, to be more cognizant of the least of these, so to speak. And so, I got to ask this question earlier today: who are the next Jesse Jacksons?
Mm-hmm.
Remember, he came to a national prominence with something called the Rainbow Coalition.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think about people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think about people like Zoran Mamdani in New York and the current mayor of Chicago and the current mayor of Baltimore. And I think about people who are sort of cut from that cloth. And so as we go forward, we have to make sure that the bench continues to remain deep for those of us who care about these issues, and make sure that Jackson's politics and the politics of that entire generation, not just Jackson, isn't forgotten.
Grateful for all of their sacrifices and grateful for your time, Professor Fauntroy, for sharing not just your knowledge of this, but the personal connections and how you are feeling today. I'm sure your students are glad to have you at the forefront sharing your vast knowledge with them.
Well, thank you for that. My students have a test on Thursday. I'm not so sure they're in love with me right now, but yes, but thank you for that.
Oh, good to talk to you.
Likewise.